Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating evolution of a colonial frontier fighter who completely transformed into a master military strategist and ultimately the architect of the United States. We so often picture George Washington as this polished, stoic elder statesman, the guy on the $1 bill, right? But his actual genius? Well, that was forged in mud, freezing snow, and absolutely relentless logistical nightmares. Years later, Washington would famously describe the early American government as merely a rope of sand. And to understand why he used such a brutal critique, we have to look closely at the harsh military lessons he learned out on the battlefield. Because he didn't come to his political conclusions sitting comfortably in some parlor somewhere. No, he learned them the hard way, literally watching his own men starve. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with his early days in the frontier crucible, look at how he forged the Continental Army, dig into his strategic adaptation and his secret intelligence war, and finally see how all of this became the exact blueprint for a new nation. All right, Section 1, the Frontier Crucible, focusing on lessons from the French and Indian War. We start with a young, highly ambitious Washington facing the harsh realities of colonial combat. Washington's early career was really just defined by raw survival. In 1754, he faced a completely humiliating surrender at Fort Necessity. And then a year later, during Braddock's absolutely disastrous defeat at the Monongahela, Washington actually had two horses shot right out from under him. He later found 4 bullet holes in his coat. But he survived, and he managed to rally a retreat. It was a brutal, brutal education in leadership. Now, imagine trying to fight a war while the politicians who are supposed to be funding you are just endlessly bickering. He realized super early on that divided, chaotic leadership literally gets soldiers killed. Seeing these competing colonial politicians completely fail to supply their troops, that planted a massive seed for his entire future political philosophy. Which brings us to the ultimate leadership test. Seriously, ask yourself, how does the commander actually win a war when his army is starving, constantly deserting, and almost entirely untrained? That takes us to Section 2, Forging the Continental Army, transforming militias into a professional force. When Washington showed up in Boston in 1775, he didn't find an army. He found an undisciplined, rowdy militia, and he had to immediately initiate strict drills to get them into shape. And to put the challenge into perspective, just look at the terrifying mismatch during the 1776 New York campaign. General Howe had 32,000 highly disciplined British regulars and Hessians. Washington? He had maybe 23,000 raw, untrained recruits. It was a mismatch of epic proportions, and predictably, it resulted in a devastating Patriot retreat. So to survive, he had to manage absolute logistical nightmares. Enlistments were expiring, desertions were rampant. At Valley Forge alone, he lost between 2,000 and 3,000 men just to disease and exposure. To literally stop his army from disintegrating, he launched the Grand Forage of 1778 just to scrounge for food, and, crucially, brought in Baron von Steuben to relentlessly drill his starving troops into a real, professional fighting force. Moving on to Section 3, Strategic Adaptation, from defensive survival to offensive coordination. You see, Washington's true genius wasn't about winning every single pitched battle. He actually lost a bunch of them. His genius was knowing exactly when to survive and exactly when to strike. Early on, his whole strategy was pure defensive survival. We're talking tactical retreats and daring hit and runs, like that famous icy crossing of the Delaware River to ambush the Hessians at Trenton. That move absolutely saved Patriot morale. But then, noticed how his tactics evolved. Later in the war, he shifted to massive, coordinated offensive maneuvers, like the celebrated March South, working directly with the French Navy. And that coordination culminated at Yorktown in 1781. 7,000. That's the key number here. Washington's grand strategy ultimately trapped over 7,000 British soldiers, forcing their surrender. It proved, without a doubt, his evolution from a frontier skirmisher into a master strategist capable of running a massive Allied siege. But wait, how did he actually pull this off? What was his secret weapon to consistently outmaneuver a force that was way bigger and way better funded? How did he know exactly where the British were going to be? Well, the answer is pretty incredible. Welcome to Section 4, The Intelligence War, America's first spy master. George Washington didn't just fight on the battlefield. He eagerly embraced the shadows of espionage to level the playing field. Enter the Culper Ring. Yep, the stoic father of our country was actively running covert spy networks. He realized pretty quickly that raw military force just wasn't going to cut it against the British Empire. So in 1778, he built this highly secretive intelligence ring to act as his eyes and ears right inside British-occupied New York. And it operated like a well-oiled machine. Covert operatives would gather intel, pass it along to Major Benjamin Tallmadge, who then routed it directly to Washington's desk. And this wasn't just some side hobby. This intelligence pipeline literally saved French forces from a devastating surprise attack. Espionage was a foundational pillar of his strategy. In fact, his spy networks uncovered one of the most infamous betrayals in history. It was his focus on intelligence that allowed Washington to thwart Benedict Arnold's treasonous plot to just hand over the critical defensive position of West Point to the British. No way he catches that without his spies. Which brings us to our final section, Blueprint for a Nation, how these battlefield lessons shaped the Republic. Ultimately, the scars of command and those terrible logistical failures directly built his vision for the United States. Just look at the trajectory here, from the brutal frontier in the 1750s through 8 agonizing years commanding the Continental Army, all the way to 1787. Dealing with the fallout of Shays' Rebellion just reinforced what he already knew. The endless frustration of fighting a war without central funding is exactly what led him to the presiding chair of the Constitutional Convention. So here's the so what of this whole explainer. His military struggles directly became his political solutions. To Washington, a strong, unified federal government wasn't just some academic theory. When you've watched your men freeze and starve because of a weak Congress, a strong central government is a matter of life and death. He took the discipline required to run an army and applied it to the bedrock of republic law. But crucially, he never used the military to seize power. By willingly stepping down and resigning his commission in 1783, at a time when he had the absolute unquestioned loyalty of the army, he set a massive global precedent. He cemented civilian control of the military, proving the new nation would be a republic, not a dictatorship. And that leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to chew on. If Washington hadn't failed, frozen, and struggled so deeply with logistics and mutinies out there on the battlefield, would the powerful centralized framework of the U.S. Constitution even exist as it does today? It's crazy to think about, but his military crucible didn't just win a war, it quite literally forged the United States. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope you enjoyed it.